She spent her life caring for strangers in their final days, until a dying mother left a letter that would change everything. Inside that envelope was an impossible request: save her son from himself. A billionaire broken on the inside, a nurse who vowed never to give herself over again, and a connection that was born between night shifts, cold coffee, and secrets whispered in the darkness. What started as care became the most unlikely love you've ever seen. This is the story of Lydia and Kaden, and it will touch your heart in a way you don't expect.
Lydia adjusted the sheet for the third time that early morning, even though she knew Mr. Harris wouldn't notice. He was sleeping deeply, lulled by morphine and the exhaustion of a body that had stopped fighting. But she needed to do it. Straighten, smooth, fold the corner carefully. It was an automatic gesture, almost a silent ritual that kept her present in that empty corridor of the Boston hospital, where time seemed suspended between life and goodbye. Her hands moved with tenderness, as if each fold in the fabric could offer one last comfort, one last proof that someone still cared. The night shift carried that peculiar weight. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled her, but the way it echoed inside her. Lydia knew every creak in the floor, every hum from the break room fridge, every muffled sigh from patients who couldn't sleep. They were sounds that had become company, a melancholic soundtrack that protected her from thinking too much. She had chosen palliative care for a reason. There, between white sheets and dim lights, she could exist without having to explain why she preferred solitude to the risk of giving herself over. After all, caring for those who were leaving was safer than allowing anyone to stay. Violet, her colleague, and the only person who could get more than monosyllables out of her, always said Lydia had a gift. "You have a calmness that soothes even the most restless," she'd comment while they prepared medication trays. But Lydia knew the truth. It wasn't calmness, it was restraint. It was the result of years learning not to feel too much, not to expect too much, not to fall apart when everything around her fell apart. She had become an expert at being present for others while remaining absent from herself. And it worked. Until that night.
Something was different. Maybe it was the biting November cold coming through the poorly sealed windows, or maybe it was that discomfort that had been growing inside her for weeks, like a hairline crack in a wall that seems solid. Lydia stopped in the hallway, holding the clipboard against her chest, and took a deep breath. The coffee in the doctor's lounge was already cold, but she'd drink it anyway. She always did. It was part of the routine, part of the shield. Everything in her life was predictable, controlled, safe, and that was exactly how it needed to be. Until Dr. Anderson appeared in the break room doorway with that look she knew well. It was the look of someone bearing news. "Lydia, I need to talk to you," he said in a low voice, almost apologetic. She felt her stomach tighten, not from fear, but from intuition. Something was about to change. He continued, "We have a new assignment. Patient with a short prognosis, complicated family, delicate situation. I thought you'd be the best option." Lydia nodded, professional as always, but inside she felt a strange wave, not of refusal, but of anticipation.
"Patient's name?" she asked, preparing to write it down. Dr. Anderson hesitated for a second, as if weighing what he was about to say. "Joanna Wilkins, 70 years old, terminal cancer, and she has a son who—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Let's just say he doesn't leave her side. Ever. He stays in the room every night, every early morning. It's intense." Lydia frowned. Present family members were common, but something in his tone said this case was different. There was more there, something unspoken, something that made the doctor choose his words carefully. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that assignment before even meeting the patient. Joanna Wilkins. The last name echoed in her mind with a touch of distant familiarity. Maybe she'd seen it in the papers. Maybe it was just her imagination. But when she opened her eyes again, Lydia knew that something was about to cut through that fragile balance she'd built so carefully. Something she couldn't adjust, smooth or fold like a sheet. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't know if she was ready.
Room 304 was plunged in thick shadows when Lydia pushed the door open for the first time. The hallway light cut through the space like a thin blade, revealing the silhouette of a frail woman in the bed and, beside her, the motionless figure of a man sitting in a chair that seemed too small for his frame. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't blink. He just remained there, elbows resting on his knees and hands clasped together, as if he were praying or giving up. Lydia couldn't tell. There was something in his posture that caught the air in her lungs, a silent tension that turned that room into a place where even breathing felt intrusive. "Good evening," she said in a professional but gentle voice, entering with the medication tray. The patient slept with irregular breathing, each exhale carrying visible effort. Lydia checked the vital signs in silence, adjusted the IV drip, and recorded everything on the clipboard with precise movements. The man didn't move, didn't say a word, but she felt the weight of his gaze, even without seeing it directly, as if he were studying her, measuring her, trying to understand who this stranger was who was now part of the last weeks of his mother's life. And Lydia, accustomed to being invisible in these moments, for the first time felt exposed.
In the nights that followed, the scene repeated itself with an almost ritualistic consistency. He was always there, always in the same position, always in silence, sometimes with his eyes closed, other times with his gaze fixed on his mother, as if trying to memorize every feature of her face before it was too late. Lydia began to notice the details. The impeccable suit he wore even in the middle of the night, the stubble that grew with each shift, the way his fingers drummed on the arm of the chair when his mother's breathing faltered. Kaden Wilkins. It was Violet who told her his name. That's the real estate billionaire, builds skyscrapers, buys companies like people buy coffee. But look at him there, he looks like a lost boy. And that was exactly what Lydia saw. Not the power, not the fortune, not the pose of a man who commanded empires. She saw the pain. A pain so familiar it hurt to recognize it reflected in someone else's eyes. It was the kind of pain that couldn't be cured with medicine, that couldn't be eased with empty words of comfort. It was the pain of someone who had waited a lifetime for something that might never come. Forgiveness, affection, a simple look of approval. Lydia knew that waiting. She knew it all too well. And that's why, on a Tuesday early morning, when he finally lifted his eyes and met hers, something moved between them. A silent connection, almost unbearable.
Will she suffer much? His voice cut through the silence like breaking glass. It was deep, hoarse, loaded with an exhaustion that went far beyond the body. Lydia stopped what she was doing and looked at him for the first time, really looked at him. His eyes were dark, deep, and there was a vulnerability in them that contrasted brutally with the firmness of his broad shoulders and clenched jaw. "We'll do everything to keep her comfortable," Lydia answered honestly, without softening, because he didn't seem like the kind of man who wanted to be spared the truth. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word, every implicit promise. Kaden lowered his gaze back to his mother, but this time his voice continued, low and hesitant, as if the words were heavy stones being pushed out. "She never forgave me for choosing business, for not being the son she wanted, for existing the wrong way." He let out a bitter laugh, without humor. "I spent 30 years building a fortune, thinking that one day she'd look at me and say it was worth it, that I was worth it." Lydia felt her heart tighten, not from pity, but from recognition. That was too intimate, too real. and she knew she should maintain professional distance, but there was something in his raw honesty that disarmed any defense.
Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who struggle to show it, Lydia said softly, surprising herself. She never spoke like this with family members, never allowed herself to cross that line. But there, in that dark room, with the beep of the monitor echoing like a metronome of life slipping away, the words came out on their own. Kaden raised his eyes again, and this time there was something different there, an opening, a crack where light could enter. He didn't respond, but the silence between them changed. It stopped being empty and became charged with possibilities. And when Lydia left the room that night, she carried with her the strange feeling that something inside her, something that had been asleep for years, had just awakened.
The early morning was especially quiet when Lydia entered room 304 and found him in a way she'd never seen before. Kaden was on his knees beside the bed, holding his mother's hand with a gentleness that contrasted with the size of his hands. And he was crying. It wasn't a dramatic cry, but that kind of contained, suffocated cry that comes out in silent tremors and tears that fall without permission. The hallway light illuminated only half his face, creating shadows that made everything even more intimate, even more personal. Lydia froze in the doorway, torn between retreating to give privacy or entering to do her job. But then he sensed her presence, turned his face, and their eyes met. And in that moment, something changed forever. "Sorry," he said in a broken voice, passing the back of his hand across his face in a hurried attempt to wipe away the tears. "I didn't want anyone to see me like this." Lydia closed the door slowly behind her and approached, not with the efficient rush of a nurse following protocol, but with the calm of someone who understood that some moments require presence, not procedures. "You don't need to apologize for feeling," she said, and there was so much weight in those words that Kaden raised his eyes again, this time really seeing her, not the nurse, not the professional in the white coat, but the woman, the person, the one who carried her own scars hidden beneath the armor of caregiving.
He released his mother's hand slowly, as if afraid that gesture meant giving up, and stood with difficulty, his legs numb after hours in the same position. He swayed slightly, and Lydia instinctively grabbed his arm to steady him. The contact was brief, but electric. Both felt it. There was something there, an invisible current connecting two equally broken people, equally frightened of letting themselves be seen. "She's getting worse, isn't she?" Kaden asked, his voice hoarse but firm, seeking the truth he already knew but needed to hear out loud. Lydia nodded slowly. "Yes, but she's not alone, and you don't have to be either." The words came out before she could censor them, and Lydia immediately regretted it, or thought she regretted it. But Kaden looked at her with an intensity that made the air thicker, more charged. "You understand, don't you?" he murmured, taking a step forward, closing the distance between them in a way that should have been inappropriate, but felt inevitable. That feeling of spending your whole life trying to be enough for someone who will never find you enough? You know this. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And Lydia felt her heart race, because yes, she knew. She knew it so well that it hurt to hear it said out loud, said by someone who seemed to have read the most hidden pages of her story.
"Knowing doesn't mean overcoming," Lydia responded, her voice barely coming out in a whisper but firm enough to be honest. "Sometimes we just learn to live with the weight." Kaden smiled, but it was a sad smile, loaded with an understanding that went beyond words. He moved another step closer, and now they were so near that Lydia could see the small lines of exhaustion around his eyes, could feel the warmth emanating from that large, exhausted body. "You take care of everyone," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on hers.
But who takes care of you? And for the first time in years, Lydia had no answer. Because no one did. Because she never allowed it. The silence that settled between them was heavy with unspoken possibilities, with longings that neither knew how to name. Then, Kaden did something that surprised them both. He reached out and, with a hesitation that revealed all his vulnerability, lightly touched her face. It was a gentle touch, almost reverent, as if he were testing whether she was real or just another illusion created by exhaustion and pain. Lydia should have pulled back, should have maintained professional distance, but she couldn't, because in that touch, there was something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Connection. Real, terrifying, inevitable connection.
Joanna's irregular breathing broke the moment like a silent alarm. Both pulled away quickly, and Lydia returned to professional mode with an effort that left her hands trembling. She checked the vital signs, adjusted the oxygen, recorded everything with mechanical precision, while her heart hammered in her chest. Kaden returned to the chair, but now everything was different. The room was the same, the patient was the same, but between them there was something new, an unspoken promise, a secret shared without words. And when, 3 days later, Joanna Wilkins took her last breath, with Kaden holding her hand and Lydia beside her, adjusting the sheet one last time, he didn't cry. He just stayed there, paralyzed, until the head nurse came in and placed a yellowed envelope in Lydia's hands. "The patient left this for you," she said. "She asked us to deliver it only after." And when Lydia read the handwritten name on the front, "For the nurse who will save my son from himself," she knew her life had just changed forever.
The envelope weighed in Lydia's hands as if it contained stones instead of paper. She was sitting in the empty break room, the coffee cooling on the table beside her, and 3 times she started to open the letter before giving up. It wasn't hers. It shouldn't be hers. Joanna Wilkins was just another patient. Kaden was just another grieving family member. And that letter was a responsibility she didn't ask for and didn't want. But the words written on the envelope echoed in her mind with cruel insistence, "Save my son from himself." As if Lydia had the power to save someone when she could barely save herself. As if she didn't know, better than anyone, that some people simply don't want to be saved. Violet entered the room with her usual relaxed manner and stopped when she saw her friend with the envelope in her hands. "Is it from him?" she asked, sitting down beside her. Lydia shook her head. "From his mother. She left it before she passed." Violet said nothing for a moment, just observed the conflict stamped on her colleague's face. "And are you going to open it?" Lydia finally raised her eyes, and there was a fear in them that went beyond the professional. "If I open it, I'll have to do something, and I don't know if I want to get involved." The words came out raw, honest. Violet sighed and held her friend's hand firmly. "Lydia, you're already involved. I saw how you look at him. I saw how he looks at you. This isn't about duty anymore. It's about choice."
3 days passed, and Kaden disappeared. He didn't return to the hospital to collect his mother's belongings, didn't answer the administration's phone calls, gave no sign of life. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air, taking with him all that intensity that had filled room 304 for weeks. Lydia tried to convince herself it was better this way, that he needed space to process his grief, that she should move on and forget that look, that touch, those words whispered in the darkness. But at night, when the hospital went quiet and she passed through the empty hallway where she used to see him, she felt an absence that hurt more than any presence ever had. It was Violet who brought the news, rushing into the nurse's station with her phone in hand. "Lydia, you need to see this!" On the screen, a newspaper article. "Billionaire Kaden Wilkins in seclusion after mother's death. Companies in crisis.
family concerned. There was an old photo of him at some corporate event, smiling that smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Lydia felt her stomach turn. She knew that emptiness. She knew the way pain could consume a person from the inside until nothing was left but shell. She knew because she'd been there, in that dark place where not even light can enter. And it was in that moment, looking at that photo, that Lydia finally opened the envelope.
The letter was short, written in trembling but determined handwriting. "Dear nurse, I don't know your name, but I know you have a good heart. My son is a difficult man, built by expectations I placed on him that he could never reach. I spent my life demanding, judging, denying the love he always offered me. Now it's too late for me, but not for him. You see in him what I refuse to see, the fragility disguised as strength. If he sinks, and I know he will sink, please don't leave him alone. Sometimes salvation comes from where we least expect it, and he deserves to be saved. With gratitude, Joanna." Lydia's hands trembled as she reread the words, and something inside her, something that had been asleep, protected, locked away, began to stir. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. She didn't think twice. She grabbed her coat, asked Violet to cover the rest of the shift, and left the hospital with the letter folded in her pocket and her heart racing. Lydia didn't have his address, but she had a hunch. There was a park near the hospital, a bench facing the river, where once he'd mentioned his mother used to take him as a child. It was a casual comment, made on one of those nights when words flowed more easily in the darkness, but Lydia had kept it. And when she arrived at the park, with the cold November wind cutting her face, she saw him.
Kaden was sitting on that bench, his head thrown back, an empty bottle beside him, his suit wrinkled and his beard grown from days and neglect. He looked like a shadow of the man who commanded empires, a shattered and raw version of someone who had finally given up pretending. Lydia stopped a few steps away, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. He didn't even notice her presence. He was lost, completely lost. And it was in that moment, seeing him there so broken and so human, that Lydia understood the truth she'd been running from for so long. She wasn't afraid of failing to save him. She was afraid of caring too much while trying.
"Kaden?" Her voice cut through the cold night air like a firm whisper, and it took him a few seconds to process that he wasn't alone. When he finally turned his head, his eyes were red, glazed, carrying an emptiness that Lydia recognized immediately. He tried to focus on her, blinking slowly, as if he were seeing a ghost or a hallucination created by drink and despair. "Lydia," he murmured in a slurred voice, incredulous. Why are you here?" She approached slowly, unhurried, and sat down beside him on the bench without asking permission. The smell of whiskey saturated the air, but she didn't pull back. She just stayed there, present, in silence, until he fell apart. And he fell apart, not with words, but with a strangling sob that rose from the depths of his chest and tore through any remnants of control he was still trying to maintain. Kaden bent forward, his face in his hands, and cried in a way that men like him never allow themselves to cry, without restraint, without shame, without defenses. Lydia said nothing. She didn't offer ready-made phrases of comfort, didn't try to rush the process. She just placed her hand on his back, a light but constant touch, and let him feel everything he'd been repressing for a lifetime. His crying echoed in the empty park, mixed with the sound of the river and the wind, and there was something cathartic in that surrender, as if finally, after so long pretending to be strong, he could just be human.
When the sobs began to subside and his breathing became more regular, Lydia spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "Let's go to my place. You can't stay here." Kaden raised his face, his eyes swollen and confused. "Why?" he asked in a hoarse voice, genuinely not understanding. "Why do you care?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of all the rejections he'd accumulated, all the times he'd offered his heart and received indifference in return. Lydia held his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her, and said with a firmness that surprised them both, "Because someone needs to care, and because you deserve it, even if you don't believe it." Getting him to her apartment was a complicated journey. He could barely walk straight, and Lydia had to support him halfway there. When they finally entered the small space she called home, simple but welcoming, Kaden collapsed on the couch like dead weight. She brought water, a damp towel, and sat beside him while she watched the man who commanded fortunes now reduced to an almost childlike fragility. "I failed," he murmured, his head resting on the back of the couch, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I built all of that thinking that one day she'd look at me and say it was worth it. But she died hating me." The pain in his voice was so raw that Lydia felt her own tears threaten to appear.
"She didn't hate you," Lydia said gently, taking the letter from her pocket. "She left you this." Kaden took the envelope with trembling hands and read in silence. Lydia watched every micro-expression on his face, the surprise, the pain, the relief, the guilt, all mixed in an emotional storm he didn't know how to process. When he finished, he folded the letter slowly and held it against his chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "She asked you to save me," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "But you barely know me. Why would you do that?" Lydia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the truth she was about to confess. "Because I understand what it's like to try to be enough for someone who will never find you enough. And I know what it's like to sink alone." The following days were a strange mix of intimacy and resistance. Kaden stayed on her couch, recovering not just from the drink, but from the emotional collapse that had been postponed for years. They talked late into the night about his difficult childhood, about her abusive family, about how they'd both built walls so high they'd forgotten what it was like to feel the sun. Lydia made coffee, he organized her books on the shelf, and gradually that small space transformed into a refuge for two wounded souls. But the outside world didn't take long to come knocking. The Wilkins family began to investigate, to question, to threaten. Phone calls came, veiled accusations of manipulation, of financial interest, of taking advantage of a vulnerable man. It was on a cold December night when the family called a formal meeting at the Wilkins mansion and demanded both their presence that everything came to a head. Lydia entered that imposing room hand in hand with Kaden, and the judgmental looks were almost palpable. The older brother, Thomas, got straight to the point. "How much do you want? How much to disappear from his life?" The silence that followed was heavy with contempt and assumptions. But before Kaden could respond, Lydia took a step forward. She pulled a paper from her purse, the formal renunciation of the inheritance that Kaden had insisted on sharing with her, and placed it on the table. "I don't want anything from him except what he chooses to give me," she said in a firm voice, facing each member of that family with unshakable dignity. "I didn't come here for the money. I came because he deserves to be loved for who he is, not for what he owns." And in that moment, Kaden knew he had finally found someone who saw him.
The rain fell hard that March night, in that way that seems to wash not just the streets, but also the old wounds that insist on bleeding. Lydia was at home, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, trying to read a book she'd already reread the same page for the third time, when the doorbell rang. She frowned. It was almost midnight, and nobody showed up without warning at that hour. When she opened the door, she found Kaden soaked from head to toe, his hair stuck to his forehead, his shirt transparent from so much water, and in his trembling hands, a bouquet of completely wilted flowers. He was breathless, as if he'd run a marathon,
and in his eyes there was a mix of fear and determination that Lydia had never seen before. "I know they're terrible," he said quickly, holding up the wilted flowers like someone offering a ridiculous but sincere gift. "I bought them in a flower shop that was closing, and the rain didn't help." He let out a nervous, vulnerable laugh. "But I needed to come. I needed to see you. I needed to say—" He stopped, took a deep breath, and Lydia saw on his face the internal struggle of a man who had spent his entire life protecting his heart and was now about to offer it without guarantees. "Lydia, you showed me that being broken doesn't mean being finished. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. And His voice failed. His eyes welled up, but he continued, "I love you, and I want to try. I want to really try."
Lydia stood paralyzed in the doorway, her heart beating so hard she could barely breathe. Part of her wanted to laugh at the ridiculous flowers. Part of her wanted to cry at the raw honesty of that moment. And part of her, the part that scared her most, simply wanted to pull him inside and never let him go. "Kaden," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm so afraid." The confession came out like a whisper loaded with years of protection, of walls built with pain and cement. Afraid of giving myself over and finding out I'm not enough. Afraid of building something and watching it crumble. Afraid of— He took a step forward, the rainwater running down his face like tears, and held her hands with gentle firmness. "I'm afraid too," he said, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that pierced through any defense. "I'm afraid of disappointing you, of not knowing how to love right because I was never taught. I'm afraid you'll wake up one day and realize I'm just a broken man with more wounds than virtues." He squeezed her hands, as if clinging to a lifeline in the middle of an ocean. "But the difference is that now I want to be afraid with you. I want to make mistakes with you. I want to learn with you. Because for the first time in my life, I found someone who doesn't want me fixed, but accepts me cracked." And in that instant, something inside Lydia broke, not from pain, but from relief, as if she could finally stop fighting alone.
She pulled him inside, closed the door, and there, dripping water on the apartment floor, they kissed for the first time. It wasn't a movie kiss, rehearsed and perfect. It was wet, salty with tears and rain, trembling with fear and hope, and absolutely true. When they separated, both were breathless, and Lydia held his face between her hands. "Will you date me?" he whispered with a shy yet bold smile. She laughed, a light laugh, genuine, full of life. "Yes, but you're going to have to improve on those flowers." He laughed too, and in that laugh there was freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, to be loved anyway. The months that followed weren't easy. The Wilkins family continued to resist, spreading rumors, trying to delegitimize her in social circles. But Kaden, for the first time in his life, chose something for himself instead of seeking external approval. He cut ties with family members who insisted on questioning Lydia, redirected his fortune to causes that mattered, and found in the nurse who cared for strangers a partner who taught him daily about compassion, presence, and forgiveness. Together, they opened a support center for grieving families, a space where people could process pain without judgment, where grief was honored and not rushed. It was Joanna's legacy, transformed into active love.
It was on a sunny autumn afternoon, almost a year after that rainy night, that they returned to the cemetery. Kaden held Lydia's hand as they walked to Joanna's grave, and for the first time since the burial, he didn't feel that crushing weight in his chest. They placed fresh flowers, this time alive and vibrant, and stood there in silence for a few minutes. Then Lydia squeezed his hand and whispered, as if speaking to Joanna, to herself, to the universe, "Forgiving those who hurt us doesn't absolve them. It just sets us free." Kaden looked at her, his eyes shining with tears that were no longer from pain but from gratitude. And there, hand in hand, before the grave of the woman who had connected them, they understood that true love doesn't fix the past, it simply offers the courage to build a different future.
The story of Lydia and Kaden teaches us something profound about the nature of true love. It isn't born from perfection, but from the courage to show ourselves imperfect. Just as she discovered that love can transform even the most guarded hearts, and as he learned that being loved doesn't depend on achievements or external approval, each of us also carries that power of transformation within ourselves. Love isn't a reward for those who are ready, it's the path that makes us ready. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over and believe in the possibility of a true connection. When we set aside the fear of being seen in our vulnerability, we make room for relationships that heal us instead of breaking us further. Lydia and Kaden discovered that loving doesn't mean fixing the other person, but walking beside them, even when the path is uncertain. And we all deserve to find someone who chooses to stay, not despite our wounds, but with them, because it's in acceptance that true tenderness resides.
Sometimes we need stories that touch our hearts to remember that life can surprise us, that romance still exists, and that passion can be born in the most unexpected places. Allow yourself to feel. Allow yourself to believe, and especially allow yourself to take the risk, because true love is always worth the surrender. If this story touched you, write in the comments, "Love transforms lives." Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience with each episode emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here you'll find stories about the power of affection, connection, and the courage to love even when everything seems lost. And this was just one of the many stories that will still move you here. Get ready, because the next chapters bring even more intense romances, unforgettable characters, and endings that will make you believe again in the power of love.